Great. On the live stream, can they see the PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes, now.
Yeah.
Still the small one, not the full screen.
Yeah. Hold on.
Yeah,
That's okay.
That's for your reference.
Yeah, that's good. I'm trying to get the full screen presentation. It's just being a bit slow to start the
maybe a couple of seconds delay.
No, I mean even on this computer.
You just simply stop share again. It is selecting the wrong file.
Yeah.
The second one.
I see what's done. Yeah.
Let's see. It should come shortly. Okay. Now
There's something.
yes,
Right. Okay.
Only 7 people content.
Good, good. Okay, it's just on this computer something. I can't get the presentation, the slideshow to show. There's that. I think just the PowerPoint is slowed down.
But it's fine.
No, but on this computer, it's not moving. Is the problem? I just close PowerPoint and start again. Maybe I'll just share this. Okay, I think that's working. Now it's working here. So I should begin so there is enough time. So I hope everyone online, you can hear me okay and either see the presentation or see my face. If there's any problem, technical problem, please message in the chat and hopefully we will fix it. Otherwise, I'll mainly talk to the classroom, but very excited. This is my debut to live stream on Facebook and YouTube, so new experience. So good morning in Thai time. Very excited to be here. My name is Andrew Logie. I'm assistant professor in Korean studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And today, this is my title. Okay, we can.
You should make it full screen first before you start sharing.
Yeah. This may work.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me know if it changes or goes wrong. Yeah, and today the thematic topic is going to be on attempted comparisons in proto-history between early Thailand and early Korea. So I'm teaching here today at Silpakorn University. I'm visiting in Thailand from Finland, this time for 1 month. And I'm involved with a project, the collaboration between University of Helsinki, Silpakorn University, and Mahidol University, together with my many colleagues actually, but this project together with my colleague, Dr. Chingjuan Yolayong, who's with us today from Mahidol University. We have a little bit of funding from the Finnish government, from the Department of Education, that's enabling travel, basically pays for our plane tickets and accommodation, both for Thai scholars to visit Finland and for Finland-based scholars to visit here in Thailand. So this is our umbrella project that we pronounce UNSEANET, short for Northeast and Southeast Asian Area Studies Network. Within Northeast, we're coming from particularly my interest in Korean studies and even a broader interest from Ajahn Jeng in Eurasian linguistics, we could say Northern Eurasia. And our collaboration in Thailand with Silpakorn University and Mahidol is to share and learn from the expertise here in Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, with, of course, a focus on Thailand. As a part of this, in November this year, we have a panel planned for the Indo-Pacific Prehistory Association Congress that is being organized and hosted by Silpakorn, hosted in Chiang Mai in November. So we have session number 25, which is the title, so similar title, Comparisons in Northeast and Southeast Asian Archaeology and Pseudo-History. And let's just attempt, if we can open this link, I will drop it in the chat. So I'll drop at least in the Zoom, don't know if I can add it to Facebook, or maybe Professor Sombat can copy into Facebook chat later. But this is the link to our planned panel for November. And at this panel, we will have 2 visiting professors from Korean archaeology professors, Professor Kwon Oh-yong from Seoul National University and Professor Kang In-uk from Kyung-hee University, and maybe some others as well. And they are the leading archaeologists in South Korea. So I hope this could be a nice opportunity to catalyze, to bring together Korean and Thai experts in early history and archaeology. So I'm quite excited for November. And what I'm going to talk about today is an attempt at the topic that I plan also to talk about in November. So this gives me a nice warm-up attempt. I wasn't planning to do this until November. So in the last few days, I frantically tried to put this together. So this is to get into the topic, proto-parallels between early Korea and mainland Southeast Asia, with a focus, I would say, on early Thailand, in fact. To get into try to get into the topic quickly, I've got a few diagrams, basic timelines lining up the chronology of early history between Korea and Thailand. Let's just see if we can zoom in. So we can see on the left side, we have early Korean, chronology of early Korean history. And on the right side, we have my attempted chronology of early Thailand. You can see the difference in my expertise. So for early Korea, I know what's going on. For early Thailand, I know some things, but not quite so much. I also think the difference is a reflection of the circumstance of what we know about early Korea or early Northeast Asia and early Thailand. And it's a reflection that for the study of early Korea, we have basically a few more sources for the early period. And this is because Korea, we think you know on the map, is close to China, basically slightly closer to China than Thailand is close to China. So in the early Chinese records, we get more details about Korea before we get so many details about Southeast Asia. So for this reason, we can see we know quite a bit of what's going on with these early polities in Korea. My focus for comparisons on the early Korea side, it's this area where, you can't see my cursor. Now you can see, yeah. But not when I zoom in, okay. The central and southern Korean peninsula, I think, is particularly productive for comparisons with early Thailand. And really the bit I'm going to focus on, or what I'm emphasizing in these comparisons, then is between this part of the Korean scheme, so southern Korean peninsula, and early Thailand, principally Dwarawadi, and this possible period of Proto-Dwarawadi. And this is my interest in proto-history. So my basic argument is that the chronology of early history for Thailand, if we accept this Proto-Dwarawadi period from 4th and 5th centuries, and then continuing to the Dwarawadi state period, has a close parallel with what's going on the central and southern Korean peninsula. Some of you may be familiar with the terms such as the Three Kingdoms period of early Korean history. And among these, the state that emerges and unifies most of the peninsula is Shilla. So we can have a comparison between Shilla and Dwarawadi. And this is basically where I started for my inspiration. So I'm interested in Korea. I have new interest in Thailand. So for me personally, it's interesting and fun to try to compare. But I think it's legitimate when I started to feel that there's this quite parallel chronology, at least not on everything, but at least we can say for Shilla and Dwarawadi. And these are important because in both cases, these are the states that their trajectory continues beyond early history. And it's from those states that we get the continuity into the medieval period and then into kind of ultimately to the modern Korea, modern Thai states. So they're quite significant in this way. We may come back, I've got some other diagrams like this, so we can come back to them as well if you want to ask more questions about them. And to look at this, what's going on in maps. Before Shilla here, actually right back, we have a little bit here marked the Samhan. Samhan means the Sam is 3, same as Thai. So the 3 Han. These are smaller states out of which the Three Kingdoms period, Korean states emerged. So to look at this period, the 3rd century, around the 3rd century CE, so the 200s CE or AD, this is what the Korean Peninsula looks like. And the so-called Samhan are the bottom 3 polities marked here. That's Mahan, Jinhan, Pyeonhan. So this is particularly the region that we're focusing on for the comparisons. But at this stage, quite a lot of other things are going on the Korean Peninsula. And this is something that makes Korean early history both fascinating and, I would argue, quite useful as a point of reference when you're studying other areas such as early Thailand or early Southeast Asia. And each of these polities, in this map, the kind of bubbles, each of these polities, they're really quite distinct in their identity, in their level of development, and the trajectories they follow. So the bottom 3, these develop into the early Three Kingdoms period states. We have, for example, on the east coast, this area, Dongye, they never develop their own state. So they are kind of pre-state circumstance, but they're active and they get absorbed into some of the other states. We have, this is similar on the east coast, similar for this Okjo marked up here as well. So on the east side, there's slightly less state development. On the west side, we have the intrusion of China, of Han Dynasty China, in the form of commanderies. So what we have around current-day Pyongyang, the capital of current-day North Korea, is the Lelang commandery that was established here 108 BCE and continued for 400 years. So you've got indigenous polities all over the peninsula, but particularly emerging on the south, on the east side. And then from the northwest, you've got this direct contact with China through the military occupation of the commanderies. So all kinds of different forms of polity interaction are all occurring within this relatively small area that is the Korean Peninsula. So it makes it really, I think, useful for studying, and it keeps it neat. You could just study Chinese history, which has all kinds of things going on, but it's very large. Here in Korea, we get kind of a very contained area where many of the different themes and ideas useful for thinking about early history, state formation, we get examples just within Korea. So that we were looking at the map on the left then, showing the early polities. The map in the middle would show the Three Kingdoms period that follows. And we can observe if the Samhan that we had here on the south, each of these evolve slow. It's more complicated, but basically they evolve into the early Three Kingdoms polities. The so-called Three Kingdoms period has 4 kingdoms, at least 4 polities, to be confusing. So in the north, we have Goguryeo, which is actually the first developing early kingdom of the Three Kingdoms period. In the south, we have 3 polities, Shilla in the southeast, Pekje in the southwest, and sandwiched in between, Kaya. Kaya is the 4th of the Three Kingdoms period. This is to do with traditional historiography, that they called this the Three Kingdoms period, and they demoted Kaya. So it gets already very messy, as you can see. So that's the Three Kingdoms. And then, as mentioned, ultimately Shilla, from in the 7th century, it defeated the other polities. And so we get a period that is then just Shilla. In Korea, they often call this the unified Shilla period. So this map, the colorful one, the colors there showing all of the Shilla territory colors are the administrative regions of that. And we can see this Schiller, it didn't occupy all the peninsula, but about the bottom 2/3 of the peninsula, that's Schiller. So by the time we're looking at this unified Schiller, this is basically the same time period as Dvaravati, when Dvaravati is, when it's thriving. So 7th, 8th, 9th into the 10th centuries, Schiller and Dvaravati. And then this is to jump to a comparison of Dvaravati. These maps, of course, I've taken from other people's research, so I'm not making any claim on copyright. These maps I'll explain in a minute. They're from some articles which I found very useful to make comparisons. So this is Stephen Murphy from 2016. But for now, we just observe this is a map that has some of the key, as far as I understand, some of the key Dvaravati sites. So this is roughly the territory of Dvaravati, with some argumentation about how consolidated this territory was. As I understand, some of the key locations are Nakhon Pathom, Ulthong, for example. So typically it's this area that's considered as maybe the heartland of Dvaravati. So we're going to compare just a little bit with Korea, but to think about distances, the scale of these areas. So on Google Maps, I tried to make these rough calculate measurements of the distances involved. So between Nakhon Pathom and Ulthong is around 65 kilometers. Between Nakhon Pathom to Shitep is around 216 kilometers. So that gives some sense of geographical scale for Dvaravati. So if we keep these in mind, the shorter example and the longer example, and just one thing to note, so I've read on Dvaravati, there's some discussion about whether it was a single state or whether it was made up of different centers. Whether these were competing centers or whether they were in alliance, all these kind of questions are open. But there was some discussion, for example, whether Nakhon Pathom and Ulthong, if they were rival centers at some point. And I understand this is very speculative discussion because no one knows. But just think about the scale. If that was true, they're only 65 kilometers away from each other. So not so large. Not such a large distance. And so here I tried to give similar scales comparing with the Southern Korean peninsula. And in the case of Korea, I'm taking as example, or as a measuring point, what's marked here is Kumsong. This is the capital, or became the capital, or was the capital of the Schiller Kingdom. It's a current-day Gyeongju in South Gyeongsang province of South Korea today. Wonderful heritage location. If you travel in South Korea, definitely go to Gyeongju to see the Schiller heritage there. And this would have been the center of the Jin Han even earlier. So we can measure the distance between Nakhon Pathom and Ulthong was about 65 kilometers. Between here, Kumsong in Korea, and down to what's marked here as Kimhae is about 70 kilometers. So kind of roughly the same distance. And this is to the Three Kingdoms period maps. The Kumsong, that was the center of Schiller. And Kimhae on the southeast coast, that was the center of Kaya. So between these distances, you had two separate polities they were rivals, and eventually it's complicated. In the mid 6th century, Schiller conquered Kaya and absorbed it. So Shilla expanded in that direction. And then if we think the comparison in the distance between Nakhon Pathom up to Shitep is about 216 kilometers. From Kumsong on the east all the way across to the west coast of the Korean Peninsula is just slightly further, 228. So I hope this supports my justification for making comparisons between early Shilla and early Thailand. I'd argue, as we just looked earlier, that the chronology is quite similar, and also the basic scale is quite similar as well. Obviously, there's many differences as well, but we've got a basic framework, I think, that justifies making comparisons. And then we can also be interested in what's different about these areas. In geography term, one key issue is that Korea is very mountainous, the topography, whereas this area of Thailand, there certainly are, there's the Phetchabun Mountains, and there are mountains, but less so. Korea is kind of 90% mountains. So looking on a flat map, we don't quite see that difference. Yeah, this was this is the abstract for my November presentation. I just pick up on the last line. Comparisons of early Korea and mainland Southeast Asia provide us an opportunity to reflect on generic models of social development calibrated against regional specificities. So making comparisons is useful because we often talk in terms of generalized models of state development, where we have like prehistory, pre-state, proto-history, and then a state. So it's very kind of universal language, but then it becomes too general. That's why we need area studies and to be interested in different regions of the world to know about the specificities within them. So between Korea and Thailand is a very useful case, I think, for identifying the commonalities and then comparing the specificities, the specific details and differences between them. So the focus would be my key interest is this area of proto-history. So we can ask, what is proto-history? I think some of you will know better than myself already. But basically, it's a transition period between what we call prehistory and what we consider history. These terms, typically, these are kind of slightly old-fashioned definitions. But basically, in prehistory, we have no written sources. So we have to rely on archaeology and things like that. In history at the bottom, we have written sources for the area. I think most of you know that's kind of like the official definition of history is the study of written sources. But of course, it doesn't switch overnight between prehistory and history. So it's very useful to have this in-between period of proto-history. And within proto-history, it can reflect the transitionary developmental period, but in historiographical terms, for proto-history, we might have some written sources, but not very detailed, and typically not produced in the location itself. So for Korea, actually both Korea and Thailand, proto-history is informed by the Chinese sources that give a little bit of mention, but not very much detail. So I think you're familiar in Chinese sources, they mention Funan, Dwaravadi, these early Southeast Asian polities, but they don't tell us very much. So this is kind of proto-history because we got a name, but we don't have much else. In the Korean case, we have a few more details, but still it's an outsider's view. It's a Chinese outsider's view of this exotic, distant location that was early Korea. So that's kind of the proto-history phase. We might also have some, the beginnings of local writing that survives, such as the early epigraphy, early inscriptions. Or we might be able to project back from early inscriptions that start slightly later, but take some of the information from those inscriptions and project back in time slightly. So if we get the mention of the name of a polity from an inscription, we may be able to guess that it started already a few years beforehand. So that's kind of the proto-history phase. We also get the transmitted local history. So for example, in the case of Korea, the earliest surviving written history today dates to 1145, the 12th century. This is the history book called The History of the Three Kingdoms, the Korean Three Kingdoms. But it's not from the Three Kingdoms period, it's from later. But within it, it contains history, some of which was probably written first in the Three Kingdoms period, but then transmitted through time. So it gets a bit distorted. So things like this, the transmitted history about the past, depending how reliable it is, if it seems very reliable, very detailed, then it's kind of, we can treat it as history. If it clearly has some distortions and is not so reliable, then we might consider it as kind of informing our understanding of proto-history. This is very much the case with the Korean Samguk-sagi, the history of the Three Kingdoms, because it begins with foundation mythology, supernatural events. So we can assume that these are not actual history, but it certainly brings in real historical detail. So you get this transition within the written history, the Samguk-sagi, between foundation mythology, supernatural events, and then gradually transitioning into detailed history that was from the transmitted sources. So I think these that's another example of sources that inform proto-history, the later tradition. So this would be a very historiographical definition of what is proto-history, basically what kind of sources we have. Proto-history can be matched with the universal time periods that we're familiar with. So again, we've got prehistory, proto-history, and the historical period. For prehistory, we have the the lithic Stone Age system. Our interest tends to start with the Neolithic period, and then this develops into Bronze Age, Iron Age. These are treated as quite universal periodizations for prehistory, but they don't fit perfect, especially the Metal Ages, the transition between Bronze and Iron Age, that it was developed in the context of European prehistory, and it doesn't always fit very well with other regions. Nevertheless, it tends to be used. Proto-history typically aligns, it tends to start from the Bronze Age potentially, and then into the Iron Age and late Iron Age. This often aligns with proto-history. And then the historical period, we stop calling things the Iron Age because we've got historical sources in the historical period. We know what's going on. We know the names of the states and we know some of the details. So then we just call it early history and into medieval history. So proto-history typically aligns with late Bronze Age into Iron Age kind of period. Alternatively, this period is sometimes referred to as late prehistory, but there's reasons why it can be nicer to use proto-history. So that's so we just discussed what is proto-history as periodization. A very closely related, but also different concept is the proto-state. And this is rather than a periodization, rather than a kind of universalistic periodization, the references to proto-states refer to the stage of development in state formation of a given state. So we understand states as being relatively complex, representing relatively complex society. And there has to have been some kind of developmental process of communities in the area coming together, forming, we got some of this terminology. So everyone's now familiar with, no one's familiar with neo-evolutionary, but everyone's familiar with the concept of bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states. So these are periods imagined. Again, these are not always used today, but we do often talk about chiefdoms as a period before the emergence of a early state. And this is really the period, so if we're talking about a proto-state, the period before it's a fully centralized, consolidated state, and by a fully centralized state might have a paramount rule, typically, not always, but typically a king, full organized religion, monumental architecture, building temples, for example, building tombs, some kind of urbanization, typically, so like a capital region. These are all things that go on the checklist of becoming a state. Before that period, then, you've got the development of those things. So that would be the proto-state period. This identifying a proto-state is very specific to the developmental trajectory of a given state. It's not a fixed time in world history. So all states that have emerged, presumably, had a proto-state period as they were developing. At least, actually, I should modify that by saying first generation states, because of course, once we go into later history and you get change in dynasties or change in states, that's a bit of a different situation. But the first generation early states, whatever time period in history they began. So for example, in China or India, we've got much earlier states. So their proto-state would be much earlier than the period of proto-states that we're discussing for Korea or Thailand now. I'll skip over some. I've got lots of these kind of slides, but I'll skip over some of this. Probably it was something very important, but let's see. I think this is just to bring us back to a reminder of our comparisons. So to focus on bringing proto-states of Thailand. So for me to try to do this research, the ideal is that I will learn Thai language and I will read the scholarship produced by the best Thai scholars in the land. And this is my ambition. And this is how I work in Korean. I work with Korean language scholarship as well as international scholarship. I'm not quite there yet with Thai, so I also rely on the international English language scholarship on early Thai history. Particularly useful for this topic. In 2016, there was a special issue of the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. This transitions from late prehistory to early historic periods in mainland Southeast Asia. And among, this doesn't have listed all the articles, but two articles I found particularly useful are Stephen Murphy's The Case for Proto-Dwaravadi and Pipal Heng's Transition to Pre-Angkorian Period. So these are two articles that I keep rereading them, partly because I have bad memory and I always forget what I've read, but because they're very useful for this process. Other people have written on these periods as well. We can go back to Michael Vickery's very famous late 1990s book, where Michael Vickery is studying, of course, early Cambodia, and he uses a term such as the Danglek chieftains to describe a period which I would argue kind of matches the proto-history again. Stephen Murphy, in his case for Proto-Dvaravati, his key argument is the key arguments are about continuity from early sites into the periods that we can identify as the state periods. So the Dvaravati sites, they have continuity from the preceding 2 centuries, the 4th and the 5th centuries. So he argues that this should be considered a proto-Dvaravati period. Again, I'll probably have to skip all the important details, but I can recommend to read his article. Perhaps just the key highlighted here, Proto-Dvaravati, as I define it, as Stephen Murphy defines it, is very much a transitional phase out of which develops the Dvaravati period that follows. If we come down to the last paragraph, I think it's always dangerous trying to jump into these quotations, but let's just read the last paragraph. In terms of Dvaravati, this evidence can be seen in the construction, so evidence for state formation can be seen in the construction of Buddhist and Brahmanical religious monuments, the sculptural tradition in bronze and stone reached by the 6th to 7th centuries onwards. So he sees the 6th to 7th centuries onwards as the period when you've got full flourishing Dvaravati. To get to that period, to have these temples, these inscriptions, iconography and everything, there must have been lots of development before then. The sculptural tradition in bronze and stone reached by the 6th to 7th centuries onwards, common pottery types being distributed throughout central Thailand and the creation of large-scale moated sites. It is significant that in this region, all these characteristics begin to appear from the 4th to 5th centuries onwards. So that's the Proto-Dvaravati period. The Proto-Dvaravati period is also the time frame where incipient proto-states emerge. And Pipal Heng, I know I see he's very active when always publishing new articles recently on early Cambodia. This is his 2016 article. Basically, he argues a similar thing for pre-Angkor. We'll see in diagrams to make this easier, but for the pre-Angkorian period. He argues for continuity from what would be prehistory to the pre-Angkor period in the archaeology, so the same sites. Let's try and elaborate slightly more. So we've got in pre-Angkor period, let's say the Junla period of early Cambodia, we've got the first inscriptions, for example, starting from I think the 7th century and some Sanskrit ones just earlier as well. The locations on which you have the sites where you have the first inscriptions, Heng demonstrates, they have earlier archaeology on those same sites. There's continuity in the communities there that continued into the pre-Angkor period for which we have the early epigraphy. So he's arguing for continuity in development. So the earliest phase, again, this would kind of be a proto phase. And what's key is he argues, therefore, to talk about these ideas of like proto phases, he talks about proto elites. It's not just theorizing, but it's based on evidence. And for Heng, the evidence is the archaeology. And actually for Murphy as well, the evidence for Proto-Dvaravati is archaeology. And this is coming back to our comparison with Korea. One of the differences in emphasis is that in the discussing proto-history for Southeast Asia, the emphasis is on archaeology because there's fewer written sources, which makes us focus more on the archaeology. In the Korean case, the weight of written historiography, the Chinese sources, is heavier. So there's greater emphasis on the proto-historical sources, if that such a thing exists. So we've got that difference. And if we go into details, we'll see more of this. This is a map from Pipao Heng's article to show the distribution of the sites that he's discussing. And I think I'll have this on diagrams in a minute, but so his argument is, he doesn't talk about proto-history, he talks about the continuity of the elites. And he identifies these terms on the earliest inscriptions that we'll see, the Bon Mulatan, which I don't know how to pronounce. So he suggests that the people who started using these titles on the earliest inscriptions, these would have been in the preceding period, the proto-period. They were the proto-elites, but we don't know who they were then because there was no history. But they start to name themselves in the earliest inscriptions of the 7th century onwards. Okay, probably not too much more time. There's potential, I could go on for about 4 more hours on some of the details. Just to come to so on Southeast Asia, the emphasis is on archaeology, basically, and looking at the continuity of archaeology. We can do that also with Korea, but there's greater emphasis on historiography as well. And in Korea, there's a concept of a proto-Three Kingdoms period, which I'll jump onto diagrams to show what's going on. This goes back to when we're discussing Korea, actually, did we have maps? The Samhan that we had, the 3 Han here for the 3rd century, we can say in the 280s CE, we've got attestation, written sources, the Chinese Sangguozhi, telling us about the Samhan, Mahan, Jinhan, Gyeonghan on the south of the peninsula. So we're interested in the transition between the Samhan and the Korean 3 kingdoms. And the problem is, in Korean traditional historiography, the 3 kingdoms, Shilla, Paekje, Kaya, and the 3 kingdoms, and Goguryeo, their foundations are placed in the 1st century BCE, much earlier. But their foundation is Goguryeo is a bit special, so we'll focus on the southern 3. Their foundation is mythological, and the details for the early periods are distorted, supernatural, and where there is detail, historical detail, it's been stretched to project further back, to get back to the 1st century BCE. So we've got this tradition in Korean historiography, which was both traditional historiography, but continues to be very influential today. If we look at this column on the left side, traditional Korean periodization, things look quite neat. So don't worry about Old Choson. We start with Old Choson. And then we get the Samhan as if a period. And you see, they have to be very early because they have to come before the 3 kingdoms, because the 3 kingdoms have established traditional foundation dates based on mythology of the 1st century BCE. So the 3 Han, they knew that there were some Han, but they placed them very early. The problem is, if we come to the next column, Chinese sources, contemporary Chinese sources, meaning contemporary to the states, we don't get the Samhan. Here are the Samhan here, because I don't have the pointer. The Samhan here. We don't get the Samhan until the 3rd century attestation of them. So if we see on the left side column, traditional Korean periodization, the Samhan are up here in the 1st century BCE. But the contemporary Chinese sources tell us that the Samhan were much later. So it makes a problem in trying to make a periodization of Korea because you have the traditional dates of the Three Kingdoms period clashing with the more reliable Chinese record of what was on the Southern Korean Peninsula. So to kind of try not to fix, but to fudge this issue, to try and come up with some compromise. In the 1970s, South Korean scholar, one of the leading scholars of the time, Kim Wol-yong, he proposed a proto-Three Kingdoms period, which is what we have in this column, South Korean historiography. So what I've tried to show in this column, we've got the Three Kingdoms here, and you can roughly by the color scheme. Before that, we have these not quite rainbow colors, but this rainbow section here. This shows the proto Three Kingdoms, where it basically mixes the Samhan and the Three Kingdoms at the same time and just calls it a proto Three Kingdoms period. So this idea of a proto Three Kingdoms period in Korean periodization was first created to try to resolve or kind of come up with a solution for the problem with the periodization of the sources and tradition. However, conveniently, this period lines up with what we could also consider proto-history. So we could generalize it on the furthest on the right-hand column, which I put as a very general state formation period. If we forget about the history and think more in terms of the archaeology and kind of what we see in the Korean record, we could see that we have this period that we can identify as proto-states. And it happens to generally align with this proto-Three Kingdoms conceptualization. So maybe I should wrap up. So I'll try and wrap up in about 5 minutes and then we can chat as well, because it's not going to be possible to get into every detail, of course, in a single session. Just a brief advertisement, if you will. If you're interested in early career, there's a very excellent series. There's a project called the Early Career Project. It was based at Harvard University and ran for about, oh no, I can't think how long, about 6 years. They produced some very good books, chapters, each chapter on different topics, many translating Korean scholars' works, so translations into English, also with some international scholars working on career as well. So these are the early career volumes, and I give these just as examples here. The volume on the Samhan period, covering both, they're kind of like a special journal volumes, if you will. It covers both the archaeology and the history, really excellent articles. So these can be really useful if you want to explore early career, if you want to make comparisons as well. This is kind of the place to look to. Okay, maybe I'll finish. There's so much more I could try and say on this topic, but I tried to finish with this master diagram that I spent a couple of days trying to put together to summarize some of the comparisons between early career and early Southeast Asia. So it's basically a more detailed version of the diagrams we were looking at before. So on the left side is early Korean periodization. On the right side, early Southeast Asia, with a focus very much informed by the two articles I mentioned there by Murphy's Proto-Dvaravadi and Heng's pre-Angkorian elites. So where I argue our comparisons are most useful, let's see if I can not destroy everything. On Korea, the central and southern Korean peninsula, so I'm going to show up. So about this, and I think this compares well with what's going on in Murphy's and Heng's article. So within this broader scheme of history, I think this is where things are informative. So this takes us back to kind of what we said at the beginning. Yeah, just lining up the information we get from Murphy and Heng's articles, we can see how the Proto-Dwalaradi period would align with the pre-Angkorian period, pre-Angkorian elites, and these are the people who identified themselves as Bon and Malatan. Heng argues then for the earlier Proto period going back into late prehistory. And then his third period of pre-Angkor is when you get the this very loaded term of Indianization, and we know the process is not so it's not just Indian culture being given to Southeast Asia; it's the adoption, autonomous adoption of some elements of Southeast Asian culture, such as religion and such as Sanskrit and Sanskrit titles, etc. So you get from this period the people in the area that's generally considered Junla now, the pre-Angkor area, they start using Sanskrit terms such as Varaman for their titles as some kind of king. In Shilla, we get a very similar process, and I got many slides that we're going to give all the details of how this happens. But basically, what I've marked here as Proto-Shilla, we have evidence for usage of indigenous local terms for the rulers. For example, they don't use the word king or they don't use the Chinese word Wang, king, in this early period. They have indigenous Shilla terms, Isagum, Malebgan, and we know these from the transmitted tradition. And they also have from local epigraphy, we get the terminology of local elites. They have a title, Ganji. So we've got evidence for these indigenous titles. But around the year 500, the beginning of the 6th century, Shilla really starts to consolidate itself. Very noticeably, the kings start to call themselves king using Chinese, the Wang. They adopt, so we've got some of the dates here. The dates in red represent earliest epigraphy, earliest inscriptions. So in Shilla, the earliest inscriptions, and these are with Chinese writing, are from this time, from the beginning of the 500s. We get the color, the number in gold or yellow is the date for the official adoption of Buddhism as the official religion. In Shilla, this occurs also in the same period, the early 6th century. If we look for these yellow dates for Pekche and Kogolyo, if we jump back, you see the yellow dates for Pekche is 384, for Kogolyo 372. That's the official adoption of Buddhism as the state religion. Of course, before then, Buddhism was already being practiced, but this is when the states declare themselves Buddhist and really start to sponsor Buddhism in the countries. So you see those kind of processes for Kogolyo and Pekche, they're earlier. Shilla is significantly later on these things. So Shilla was the late developer of the three kingdoms. And the date in pink is the first attested diplomatic mission to China. So again, Shilla is much later than the other kingdoms on these things. So Shilla's, all these things start at the beginning of the 6th century. Adoption of Buddhism, adoption of Chinese title as Wang, etc. So we can really see this is the moment we could argue Shilla, or we could argue before this period, Shilla was actually proto-Shilla. It was the proto-state period. And we can finish by observing that this lines up the this transition between a proto-Shilla, and by nobody else calls it, I'm the only person who calls it proto-Shilla. If you say this in Korea, they might object. But this lines up with the transition proposed by Murphy from Proto-Dvalavadi to a Dvalavadi period. The very last thing just to say about that is the difference of context in proposing a proto-period for Korea and for Dvalavadi. In the case of Dvalavadi, previously, the Dvalavadi period started from where we have Dvalavadi marked here, started from, now I've forgotten when that is, the 6th century. And before that, there wasn't considered to be anything, like it was considered prehistory. So to propose a proto-Dvalavadi period, if you will, is very kind of positive and constructive. It's saying there wasn't only prehistory, there wasn't kind of primitive prehistory until that period. No, actually Dvalavadi has a longer, deeper history in this period that can be referred to as the proto-period. So it can seem very kind of positive and constructive. The problem with doing this for Korea is because we have the traditional sources saying that Shilla began in the 1st century BCE, for me to go to Korea and say, actually, this was not a state until the 6th century, it seems kind of negative or critical, or so I think you can understand that it gets more sensitive. So I think this is a legitimate comparison, but the context and how these proto-periods, so this is probably why in Korea, nobody talks about a proto-Shilla period, because they have the history and the tradition to say that they already had a state. Whereas in Thailand, it's more exciting, you could say. But I think both are exciting, and this is where I will finish talking. So thank you very much for probably went a bit over an hour. And certainly, if there's any time for questions or comments, happy. And also thank you to everyone online, Feni. Or if any professors have comments that they could add for. I need the microphone.
Have free yeah, right?
Yeah.
So in the case of the Varavati, because the Varavati also not a separate kingdom. They also side by side with the Angkorian and pre-Angkorian. And one more thing, I may ask you about to think about the southern part of Thailand that according to the Chinese record is also mentioned many local kingdoms, something like Panpan, Takola, and Lankasutan. Yeah, and I also don't know much about this context from the Chinese record. And just recently, in the case of Proto-Varavati, we also have some project like Suvarnabhumi project that for in our case, when we study about the inscription, and previously we limit to only inscription with the Pallava script that is in the Varavati. And now we go beyond. Maybe the source of the Proto-Varavati as you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah.
And we also find many good example from the southern part, which seem elder than other Thailand. Is starting from the maybe 3rd BC, just only small one. But in around second century, we have a really small gold coin. Is from the Thong southern part of Thailand with the inscription. Is maybe the earliest name of the king of southern Thailand.
Oh, very interesting. Now, Sunshine. Yeah.
Yes.
And so on this tape, I used the red number for the dates to show the earliest inscriptions. But again, there's some evidence of writing before then. Most famously among the three kingdoms, archaeology, not the three, sorry, the Samhan, so the preceding period, they found evidence of a writing brush. So if you've got a brush, then you know that they were writing at this period. And because we've got the influence in the red, the Lulang Commandery, the Chinese commandery located on the north of the peninsula, we know that this, at least from this period, maybe even slightly before, they were beginning to communicate with China, you being able to use written Chinese, for example. So similarly, these processes, beginning of writing, etc., they go back deeper.
The Samhan is maybe the model to study through because Thailand also we have three part that maybe developed into the state early. Northeastern part is under the pre-Angkorian circumstance, and for the central Thailand in the hollow of the Varanasi, and the southern Thai maybe the Proto-Histories. So I think we can take the model of Samhan to study the Proto-History of Thailand.
Yeah. I think that could be productive. We have to try.
Very interesting. And I think you spend a lot of time
making a table.
Such a detailed chart is also very easy to understand the context of the development of the state in Korea and Southeast Asia.
Well, I had the same because I'm reading different articles and things. I get in my head, I got some idea that Dwaravadi, maybe it seems quite similar period, and pre-Angkor as well seems to have some similar chronology. But it's only when I try to really make a table to really check that I feel justified that it works.
In your opinion, what do you think about the Dwaravadi kingdom? Is just only absolute kingdom? That means the one king, and if maybe have a small decentralized to the only one center, or maybe separate center.
So I do not have an opinion, but I think the analogy to Korea is useful, that we see even in a similar scale area, you can have multiple smaller polities. So yeah, I don't know. I only know that there's debate on this. I had a quote somewhere on the slideshow. I actually put some quotations from Peter Skilling from his chapter. There's a very useful book defining Dwaravadi that Ajahn will tell you with Ajahn Kangwon. You have a chapter on the end of Dwaravadi. That's where I got this date for the end of Dwaravadi. Okay. In Peter Skilling's chapter in the same book, he argues strongly against a single Dwaravadi And he argues that it should be seen as kind of a period that had multiple polities, multiple centers. And I think certainly through comparison analogy with Korea, that would be very possible as well.
Yes, that also can you go back to the early slide that showing this time of
Yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I have to get to the Zoom.
Yeah. Is at least to set the to talk and
Just
want to be
yeah.
And for I don't know this area. Maybe locally also the important one.
I just tried to share the screen again. I think, is it sharing? Oh, it's got stuck.
It's not sharing.
Share. I need to share the screen. That's okay. Yeah. Okay. I think that's yeah.
Yes, I.
It will come.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
I think this area also quite important maybe around the center.
Yeah.
In the area of locally, because locally we also have the silver coin with the inscription getting to around 7th century with the Logie. And in our article also the founding is mentioned only the name, always the name of Logie. For the city, we don't know the exactly name, the ancient name of the site.
Yeah.
Only the new one with the Jackson that Professor Kamwon proposed for Wasantatura.
So this is when, in the case of Korea, for the Samhan, this map is Schiller, but talk about the Samhan, we have the opposite situation. So like you said, we don't know the names for the Twalavadi cities. For the early Korea, from the Chinese source Sanggoja, we have many place names of the small polities. So even from the Samhan, the Mahan on the southwest, we've got a list of 54 polity names, but we don't know where they, we know a couple we have an idea, but we don't know where they are. So it's the opposite situation that we've got all these place names recorded from the histories, but we don't know what to do with them. And that causes some problems as well, because there's a lot of time is spent on historical geography, trying to match these names to places, but there's limited evidence. For the other two, the small Samhan, Jinhan and Gyeonhan, each of those were said to have comprised 12 sub-polities. And those, so the Han were not states. This is why the questions what they were. They were more like conglomerates of or confederacies, these kind of things, as smaller polities. And it's out of those, each of the Samhan, the three Han, one of those small states has a name that links them to the three kingdoms period polities. So basically the three, actually not Petra, but Schiller Empire especially, we can see how they developed from one of these very small polities within the three Han. Just in the remaining time.
One thing that I think is also interesting in our field, like to invent a kind of script, like in the case of King Orang and in the case of Korea. And Korea script also produced invented by one king.
Yeah, in the 15th century by King Sejong in 1440s. Yes, that's a major event for Korea. Until then, actually, Ajahn Tingjuan knows even more than me on the early writing systems of Korea. So they use, their inscriptions are mostly in Chinese language, but just sometimes there's a hint of Korean influence in the way they write Chinese. And they also had some systems to write vernacular Shilla language using Chinese characters. I just wanted to show, I know many professors interested in epigraphy here. So Korea, I mentioned briefly the earliest stele texts, the Shilla, for example. One of the really great things about doing research on Korea is digitalization. The Korean government have digitalized nearly all their sources, including, so we have databases of inscriptions. So on this slide, the two steles that were relevant they contain information with indigenous titles, this kanji I mentioned, for example. They come from these two steles, one dated 503 and 524. And the earliest surviving Shilla stele, the top one, is 501. And hopefully if we click on these, I can show you the database for the steles, including their rubbings. They can see it. That's fine. Good. Yeah. So this is, but it's not showing here. I know why. I need to. Yeah, this is the Korean database of inscriptions, and this takes us to one of the Shilla stele. This is the name, the Uljin Bongkyongni Shilla stele, Shilla P. If we go to Wonmun, the original image, we get the scan of the rubbings. Just give it a moment to load up. Yeah, it takes a little bit of time, but sure, yeah.
This is the first time I heard about Proto-Histories. So I would like to ask, what is the main purpose of researching or studying about Proto-History? Like, what should be like if we want to study prehistory, we will go for some archaeological evidences, and for history we will go for epigraphy or just written text or any kind of text. It was about proto-history.
So I think it's the transition between these two periods. So rather than having a sudden change, including a sudden change in the way we study, because if we study prehistory only with archaeology, and then we suddenly jump to only history sources and we stop doing archaeology, it's too different. So it represents and presumably in reality, historical reality, the sudden change. One day you wake up and it's history. So the proto-history period is basically useful because it gives a name to the transitionary period. And it's particularly a period where we can bring together archaeology, early epigraphy, what we know from early history sources. So it's a useful periodization, really.
Like some kind of in between.
Yeah.
But then have some gap of time to study. Like, for example, I'm asking you just project to the proto-state. From shipstone to proto-state, and then after proto-state to be state.
Yeah.
That's kind of proto-state. Also, one kind of thing to mention or proto-history.
Yes.
How can you identify proto-state?
Oh, that's one of the key questions in these articles as well. They talk about, like, can you identify the proto-state? And so their argument would be you can through archaeology, and it would be where you would see evidence for the beginning features of full states. So, for example, if you found archaeology of like early temples, like this would indicate you've got the beginnings of consolidated state. So this would be proto-history. So this is the key thing. It's not just theoretical, but you should be able to identify it in archaeology or through early sources that might give some clues about that period. Okay, so, I lost it because I lost it. Anyway, so we can, from the database, we can zoom in on the, we can zoom in on the scanned rubbings. It will come back later. And for each, this is on the inscription database. For each inscription, we get details as well. So for the Bongpyeongni Shilla stele, this is the decipherment of the Chinese characters. And you can see almost every single one has some kind of a footnote to discuss the meaning. So we get the original, don't know if it's going to come back. Here. So we get the rubbing, but it's a bit slow to load, but it's there. We get the, yeah, it is being very slow, but it's there. We get the decipherment of the original Chinese, and then we get Korean translations and discussions in these different sections. And this database, it has most of the steles inscription, not just stele inscriptions, actually all kinds of inscriptions known in Korea. This is the front page of the database, the Korean early inscription database. and it's by different polities. So these are the three kingdoms polities: Goguryeo, Paekje, Shilla, Kaya, and under each of these are different kinds of inscriptions. So the steel inscriptions, stone carvings, inscribed stone carvings, Buddhist statue inscriptions, tombstone inscriptions, metal inscriptions, tile inscriptions, what's it called? I've forgotten the word for that, and earth inscriptions. So this is a great database for working on epigraphy for Korea. We can do, for Goguryeo, the most famous inscription is the Kwangeto stele, which if that loads up, it can be. That loads. The Kwangeto stele. Is it coming? Just I can't quite hear.
So is there any kind of source about probably delegates from Southeast Asia to Korea? Because you mentioned that during the period of King Taejo, there was some kind of people coming from the south. You see that probably also it might go back further to the late Korean period.
Very limited evidence. This is a topic some scholars have looked into. So contact between the Korean Peninsula and Southeast Asia. Actually, the Professor Kwon Oh-young from Seoul National University, he's looked in about early history and the possible evidence of trade, maritime contact between particularly Paekje of the three kingdoms on the southwest, and even going back to the Samhan, down to the area that would be Funan and the Mekong Delta, because they found the glass beads that have been found on the Korean Peninsula. Some of those are the same beads. They were produced in Southeast Asia. So there was some kind of network going back very early. But in terms of recorded history about diplomatic meetings, there's no evidence. It may have happened, especially in Korean medieval period of Goryeo, which is similar time period to Angkor. Almost certainly there would have been some visitations, but we don't have recorded records about them. Yeah, so there's no records of direct contact really until the modern period. Again, there would also have been some meetings in China. So missions from Korea and missions from the Dvaravati and other states, particularly in Tang, China. There's this famous source with the paintings of the missions coming from different areas. And there's the pictures of those identified with Dvaravati in Southeast Asia and those identified with Pekche in Korea. So there was some contact, but very limited records about them. Yeah, this is the Kwangeto still reading. I'm afraid to zoom in because I might lose it again. Here we go. Yeah, so they're good quality scans is one thing. So very good if you really want to study the inscriptions. We can do this. In some of the other photos, some of the other scans, this was a 4-sided stele, 6 meters high. It's really huge, very famous text dated to 414. It's located on the current day border between China and North Korea on the Yalu River. And if we're lucky, to see the stele. So it's located in Jian, which is the location of the Goguryeo capital on the Yalu River. If the Chinese Baidu maps works, we can actually do like a street view to see the Kwangeto stele. And it's an extremely important source for Goguryeo history. We zoom on the China Sino-Korean border. So this is Jian today. This is a major site for Goguryeo heritage and history. And there's a tomb of Kwangeto, who was the king. And a section of the presentation is going to go into details. He's the king of the late 4th century. And for Goguryeo, the transition between maybe a proto-state and a full state would be across the period of the 4th century. And you have in the end of the 4th century, this king Kwangeto, who massively expanded Goguryeo's territory. So he's a very successful conqueror. So in this little park, let's see if this works. This is the stele, and so it was erected by his son, the next king, Jiang Suwang, in 414. So really, you can see a little bit here. It's a very spectacular location. Now you can go inside, but you have to go. There's a guard, and they let you inside if you want to see closer. If you visit, this is from a distance. So it's 6 meters high, and on all 4 sides, it's got full inscription on it. And nearby, there's tombs. So this is believed to be the tomb of Kwangeto, that's the king for whom the inscription exists. It's near both at the same time, but they're next to each other. Yeah, okay, I'll stop there. On my phone, I've got photos of the inscription.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So, if we talk about the policy in the ancient times of Southeast Asia, we think about one of the theories about the mandala system.
Yeah.
So I want to know, and I don't know really much. I don't really know about Korea. I just want to know that in Korea they have the same idea of controlling the ancient government in ancient Korea, similar to Southeast Asia, using the authors of mandala system.
They don't use the same terminology. So they don't talk about mandalas in Korea or Northeast Asia. I think some of the concepts is based on my very limited understanding of mandala system. It basically emphasizes the center, and then you have concentric influence expanding out. So the outside, the problem is today in modern history, we always think of very like national borders. And of course, in early history, there was no such concept. You had your influence was in the center, and then to the extent that you could influence other areas, you did, so it gradually gets weaker. In this period, the three kingdoms, they're fighting each other all the time. So the border changes a lot. So I guess I can't answer very exactly, but we don't use the term mandala in Northeast Asia. I don't know if the mandala in Southeast Asia, was it used at the time, or is it a modern term to describe the concept?
It's about the sections of the use of scholar in the Greek time that they study about the ancients, and they say and they try to find out the way of working in the ancient time. And they found that they use the system of mandala system in Southeast Asia. So if I'm not confusing, this idea was that we get it from Jawa, Indonesia, and then they apply it to mainland Southeast Asia.
Right. Yeah, in Korea, they don't have that as a system. They do have a concept. Most of the states seem to have some concept of inner territory, which would typically be their traditional heartland territory, and then an outer territory. That's definitely the case with Shilla, for example, where it stayed located in the southeast in the modern Gyeongju throughout its history. So even after it expanded and unified the peninsula by destroying the other kingdoms, it kept its capital in the original location. That may have been a weakness in the end because it meant it wasn't centered on its new territory. But it had a definite distinction between the original elite based in the capital. They had their own titles, and then more provincial titles for their outer territory. So I think there's some overlap. And some of that's in the case of Northeast Asia, the structures, they had their indigenous structures, but some of their concepts and ruling structures were adopted from Chinese practice, where you have the system of provinces and commanderies, outer commanderies. So such as one of these outer commanderies was in Korea itself. So I think that was the way they tended to conceptualize their administrative organization.
About the terminology of the mandala, I think it is the new terminology for modern scholar. But in the inscription, especially in South Asia, they use the word Samantaraja, meaning Vasto.
Right.
So this is the idea from India.
Right, yeah.
So we use the word Samantaraj.
Samandarajan.
Not mandala.
Right, yeah. I've seen reading articles on, even on Dvalavadi, I've seen some Western scholars use mandala to refer to the concept of what Dvalavadi might have been.
It's like we cut the onion. We have so many.
Yeah,
layers.
yeah,
It's Samantaraj.
yeah. I think it's a useful conceptualization, even for kind of a modern understand. So using it, not the original meaning, but as a modern scholar, it's probably a useful conceptualization for thinking about ancient polities, because they didn't have strict outer borders. They had a center, and their power and influence gradually like weakened as it expanded. Someone very late. I can stop. The database is a bit too slow to load, but trust me, it's there.
Next one question from the audience. A general question, also very useful for bigger audiences. If they want to study more about history of Korea, but in Thailand we don't have much many sources that we can read in Thai. But what kind of sources would you recommend these interested people to study about the Korean history and have general history of Korean Peninsula?
For general history of Korea, so we have, as Korean studies scholars, we have endless debate about this, because we always complain that the general histories, the survey histories that try to do all of Korean history, they always have some problem. If you zoom in on any period, they have mistakes and they get it wrong, etc. So it's quite hard to recommend any one general survey. So I won't say, if anyone wants to ask me personally, I can give some recommendation.
Possible to be specific. For example, what we recommend is firstly interest in comparing Ayutthaya and Choson, for example, or Korea and Sukhotay.
Yeah.
Zoom into Korea.
Yeah.
Choson.
It's a good question. For Choson dynasty period, which is contemporary with Ayutthaya, among other things, there's actually quite a lot of English language scholarship. So there would be no one book. Have to recommend quite a lot. So I'm not going to do it off the top of my head. For Koryo, which is the medieval period, there's slightly less writing, but there's a few good books. I can start Googling them, but I think
any question? Last year, would like to thank you, Professor Logie, for enlightening us with the comprehensive study of Proto-Histories between two emerging area, Korea and Dvaravati. Last year, I would like to invite Professor Sombat, the director of Sanskrit Studies Center, and also the admin of the Sanskrit Studies Center, to say thank and give some souvenir.
On behalf of the Faculty of Archaeology, the Department of Foreign Languages, and the Sanskrit Studies Center, I would like to say thanks to Dr. Andrew Logie to provide us, to give us the profound knowledge of the total history between Korea and Thailand, especially when we talk about the Dvaravati period and the history of Korea. I have very less knowledge about this. So I'm sorry for everyone in this room. Actually, we would like to have the Thai translation, but since we have no time, quite long, I hope everyone can listen and watch again in Facebook page of the Sanskrit Study Center. Now, I ask Ajahn Dawon to give some token of appreciation to Dr. and Bruno to give his photo. Thank you very much. Yeah, now we have group photo for memorable moments. Please. Okay.
Online to read.
Thank you for the participant, online participant, for listening and watching us for long time. And then may we stop the live stream here now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Should I end the Zoom?
Yeah.